Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to one of our community's most special events, the Oliver Tambo Lecture. I wish to express my gratitude to everyone who has worked to make today's gathering possible, including the Lecture Fund. I'd also like to thank the distinguished guests who have joined us today, especially our featured speaker, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. Dr. Ramphele, it's an honor and privilege to have you back here at Georgetown, and I know I speak for everyone in this auditorium by saying we look very much forward to hearing your reflections this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Scott Taylor for his contributions to our community as director of our African Studies program. He'll moderate the Q&A later this afternoon. And lastly, thank you to each of you for joining us today for this very special lecture. It's a privilege to share this moment with you. We meet on the anniversary of a consequential moment in history. 50 years ago this month, the Rivonia trial began, which led to the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and several other anti-apartheid activists. It's often referred to as the trial that changed South Africa. Mr. Tambo, the namesake of this lecture series, was himself included as a, quote, co-conspirator in the Rivonia trial, but living in exile at the time, he was able to continue his work to build international pressure in the struggle to end apartheid. In January 1987, we were honored to host him here at Georgetown to deliver a lecture here in the United States at a significant moment in the anti-apartheid movement as its support throughout the world grew, but conflict within the country worsened. The idea to establish a lecture series in Mr. Tambo's honor at Georgetown originated with a conversation with Thabo Mbeki, who was crucial to the efforts to bring Mr. Tambo here in the late 1980s. In 2000, he suggested the series as a way to honor Mr. Tambo's legacy, as well as the legacy and lessons of the anti-apartheid movement. 13 years after Mr. Tambo's lecture, Mr. Mbeki, as the new president of South Africa, inaugurated the Tambo Lecture Series, offering its first address. In his remarks, then President Mbeki remembered the namesake for this lecture series by saying, Oliver Tambo was a wonderful human being. He brought to the struggle a passionate opposition to racism, sexism, and all forms of discrimination, honesty, a fearless devotion to principle, and respect for all human beings, regardless of their station in life. Over the years, through this lecture series, we've recognized individuals who share this commitment, who honor and work to build upon the legacy of Oliver Tambo, people like President Mbeki, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, President Obasanjo of Nigeria, Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the United Nations. A few years ago, South African public servant and leader Trevor Manuel. Today we add to this list a woman who has dedicated her life and her work to the betterment of South Africa and the entire global family. A scholar and educator, a doctor, a community activist, and a global public servant committed to human development. Dr. Ramphele has helped to create opportunities for development and forge pathways for progress throughout South Africa. Facing adversity as a young woman due to her country's apartheid system, she overcame a ban that prohibited black students from studying mathematics and science, and in 1972 earned her medical degree. As a student, she was elected chairperson of the local chapter of the South African Students Association, and later she helped found the Black Consciousness Movement. During this time, she worked to establish community health clinics and organize citizens through her work with the Black community programs. In 1976, following the Soweto uprising, she was detained without trial for her activism. And shortly after being released, she was banned under apartheid and sent to a small, remote, and deeply impoverished area. For 7 years, she lived there, undeterred in her pursuit to help create a better life for every South African. While there, she established a community health program and worked to empower women in the community. During this time, she also earned a Bachelor's of Commerce and diplomas in both public health as well as tropical health and hygiene. After the banning order against her was lifted, she left for Cape Town and began a career in the academy, following in the footsteps of her parents, who were both educators. She joined the University of Cape Town as a research fellow in 1986, earned her PhD in social anthropology, and became the first Black woman to serve as vice chancellor at any university in the country. Building upon her work in the academy, she was the first South African to serve as a managing director at the World Bank, where she was in charge of human development. And later, along with her son, she created Circle Capital, an investment holding company dedicated to empowering communities. And always seeking to build a better society, this year she founded and leads AHAN, South Africa, a new political party called A Party for All South Africans. It is dedicated to building a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. It is a great privilege and an honor for me to introduce to you Dr. Mamphela Aleta Ramphele for the Al the Tambo Lecture.
Dear friends, President Joya, Dean Lancaster, honored guests, faculty, students. It's wonderful to come back to this beautiful city with such fond memories of my stay here whilst I was working at the World Bank. And so just looking at the street where I used to take my afternoon walks has really made me feel at home. Thank you for honoring me with the invitation to join the company of those who have delivered this lecture, named for one of South Africa's most distinguished sons. It is a particular privilege to me to come here to reflect on our progress and our challenges, since by giving Oliver Tambo that platform in 1987, when he was the leader in exile of the ANC. You as an institution played an important role in introducing him and his ideals to the American audience, and this during an era where conservative Western governments were still describing leaders of our liberation movements as terrorists. Your School of Foreign Service is renowned for its role in nurturing diplomats and public officials, and in setting and guiding foreign policy agendas. I learned that you have just inaugurated the School of Public Policy. Congratulations to all of you for this wonderful achievement. I'm sure the McCord School of Public Policy will play as important a role as the School of Foreign Service in improving the standards of governance, not only in the United States, but around the world. Finally, on a personal note, I'm proud that my son, Hlumelo Biko, had the privilege of a graduate school education here at Georgetown. Against the background of what's been happening in Washington recently, I find it a little ironic that I'm here to discuss with you my deep concern about standards of government in our South African democracy, since it seems that at times there is an influential part of your body politics that doesn't seem to want to have a government at all, or if they are to have it, it's got to be really at a minimum. To understand why Oliver Tambo's legacy is important to our country, let me tell you a little about him. He was a distinguished student of math and science at the University of Fort Hare, the pioneer of university education for Black South Africans. He went on to become an outstanding educator at the church-run St. Peter's School in Johannesburg, during which time he also became a founding member of the ANC Youth League. He left teaching to study law and was later admitted as an attorney, practicing in Johannesburg with Nelson Mandela, until he was forced to leave the country when the ANC was banned in 1960. In exile, he became the leader of the ANC, playing, as his biographer has said, the pivotal role of transforming the ANC from a small group of well-educated petitioners to a broad-based militant liberation movement. This short sketch helps to explain a number of characteristics about Oliver Tambo. His abiding interest in education, reflected in his organizing schooling for educating of refugees and activists who had fled the country after the Soweto uprising. His thoughtfulness, his stature as an intellectual, and his commitment to human rights, leading him to set up an independent inquiry into abuses in ANC camps, and later to initiate a Bill of Rights. He was also an internationalist who built the ANC in exile by forming alliances and partnerships and persuading governments to boycott and isolate the apartheid regime. In all his endeavors, he was, as one of the founding members of our Constitutional Court, Albie Sachs, said, a natural Democrat. And his biographer has written that his followers said that he personified the lure of altruistic ideals, spiritual affirmation, and allegiance without material rewards to which they had committed themselves when they first joined the movement. At Oliver Tambo's funeral in 1993, Nelson Mandela said of his old law partner, Oliver lived because he surrendered his very being to the people. It is with sadness that I have to say today, nearly 20 years after our liberation, that although our achievements have been considerable, we are not living up to the ideals of Oliver Tambo. Many South Africans feel that the leaders of my generation have failed to deliver on the promise of freedom so that many of South Africans can enjoy the fruits of that freedom. Last week, the latest edition of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, the leading survey of the quality of governance in 52 countries across Africa, was published. At one level, South Africa performs well on the index. Compared to many African countries, we are still a land of immense potential, well endowed with natural, mineral, and human resources. We have one of the world's most admired constitutions, which on paper protects fundamental human rights, enshrines respect for the rule of law, and affirms the values of dignity, equality, and freedom. Our democratic government in 1994 inherited a relatively developed economy with some of the best infrastructure on the continent. But what is distressing is to see the areas in which the quality of governance in South Africa is slipping. In two of the four main categories used by the Ibrahim Index as benchmarks to measure the quality of governance, participation and human rights, and safety and the rule of law, our score has declined significantly against the figures of 2000 when the data was first gathered. The Ibrahim Foundation regards this decline as notable. We have improved in the category of human development, but in 2012, we still fell behind countries like Tunisia and Botswana. In education, we fall behind Ghana. In healthcare, we were lower on the index than Libya, imagine, Algeria, and Egypt. We have improved in the category of sustainable economic opportunity, but our annual growth rates are below the average in Africa. And the overall statistics mask the huge disparities between rich and poor, matters to which I will return. Speaking in Cape Town earlier this month, the former UN Secretary General, as the President said, one of your past speakers in this series, said that members of Parliament, as the politicians in closest contact with citizens, have an important role to play in holding leaders accountable. But in South Africa, that role is undermined by our electoral system of proportional representation. You don't get to Parliament in South Africa because the people in your constituency vote for you. You are appointed from a list drawn up by your political party. The system was adopted in 1993 as a bridge to give comfort to minorities so that they are not completely excluded from Parliament. But the effect, after so many years at the national level, has been that legislatures are more beholden to party bosses than they are to voters. Kofi Annan added in his Cape Town speech, after all, it is transparent and accountable institutions, not strong men or strong leaders, that safeguard democracy and create the conditions for peace and prosperity. But in South Africa, the institutions underpinning our democracy are either underperforming or under fire from within the governing party. Until quite recently, we had a great deal of confidence in the Independent Electoral Commission. But in the past year, that has been eroded by maladministration right at the very top. And recently, we had an official of the IEC refusing to register independent candidates for a local election in order to protect the governing party. Our national ombudsperson, the public protector, is doing an extraordinary job in exposing corruption and poor administration. But members of the governing party in Parliament, who should be defending him, instead give every impression of trying to undermine him. Our president has manipulated the justice system in order to avoid charges of corruption that are still hanging over him. He's fighting at every step to avoid surrendering for public scrutiny the documents upon which prosecutors base their decision to withdraw charges of corruption against him. The appointment of a new National Director of Public Prosecution has been mired in controversy, with the president's first choice dismissed as not a fit and proper person. Prosecutors acting under the leadership of a temporary director have dropped corruption charges against a number of prominent figures because of their closeness to the politically connected people in the party. whilst our courts are still independent, government representatives in the commission which recommends the appointment of judges show every sign of seeking candidates who are sympathetic to the executive rather than those who stand the scrutiny of merit, as was the case when President Mandela was president. We were very proud of the human rights lawyers who occupied the branch. And right now, our apex court, the Constitutional Court, is embroiled in scandal as a result of a private appeal made to 2 of its members by a judge president in the lower court to make sure that those judges favor President Zuma in a matter which was before that court. Our civil and political freedoms are at risk. Our country has lost the moral authority and the international respect it enjoyed when we became a democracy, largely because we have failed to understand the complexity of formulating foreign policy positions in an interconnected world. We have not utilized the expertise that resides among South Africans. The most serious flaw in our foreign policy stances is our failure to consistently align our policies with the human rights principles of our Constitution. We have taken positions on matters such as Zimbabwe, Darfur, and Burma that are at variance with our human rights principles. Our global standing has been diminished by the surrender of our national sovereignty to appease foreign powers such as China, as demonstrated by the denial of visas to the Dalai Lama. In the African Union, we are failing to speak up clearly and unequivocally against African leaders who seek to avoid being held accountable for crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. We have come a long way from the altruism of Oliver Tambo. 25 years ago, a decision to join one of the banned liberation movements was a decision to risk imprisonment, even death, at the hands of the apartheid hit squads. Today, decisions to join the now governing party is often driven, motivated by a desire to access jobs or other resources. The average member of the ANC is often in the party for the opposite reasons his or her forebears were. Self-interest has become the driving motive of many of those in positions of authority who should be focused on serving the public. At every level, from the cabinet to local administration, public representatives or officials or their families, they do business side by side with the very government which pays them. In the Eastern Cape province, where health and education systems are collapsing, the government's own statistics show that 8,000 public servants are both being paid by the state and earning money from private businesses with the very Department of Health. And the party, the government, the president, and the state have merged into a monolith that acts with impunity. In the most blatant example of a conflation of conflicting interests, the ANC has established an investment arm, ironically called Chancellor House, the name of the office where Mandela and Sisulu practiced law. This Chancellor House raises money for the party by entering as a black economic empowerment partner in commercial deals such as big infrastructure projects involving state-owned enterprises. The South African Auditor General tells us that in 2012 alone, $2.5 billion of public money was wasted through corruption, negligence, and incompetence, robbing citizens of the vital services and denying the economy the investments it needs for us to thrive. The consequences of these failures in government are nowhere more apparent than in the education system. Of the 1.1 million children who started school in 2001, 66% left school or dropped out by 2012 without any qualification. Only 10% of those who were in that original 1.1 million children were eligible to go to university. It's a wasteful, criminally wasteful system. In the same year, 12-year-olds that were tested attained only 43% in literacy tests and a shocking 27% in numeracy tests. I have said on numerous occasions that our government is delivering education that is worse than the education we got under apartheid. And this in a system which was designed to give us inferior education, to then be worse than that is criminal. Many young people today can't find jobs because they can't read, they can't write, they can't think logically. And the failures of our underperforming education is leading to an underperforming economy. We don't have adequate skills to run a modern 21st century economy. We have about 800,000 vacancies for skilled jobs alongside 600,000 graduates who can't find jobs because their skills are not what the market requires. The IMF has also issued reports that give us a warning of our declining growth rate. We are now, this year, estimated to grow at only 2%, when we know we need to be growing at 5% plus to just keep a lid on the unemployment rates. The IMF survey accompanying this report is that at these growth rates, the economy creates jobs, but not enough for the growing labor force and those currently without work. Unemployment remains stubbornly high, above 20%, but if you take into consideration those who have given up looking for a job, we are really close to the 40s. And for young people, the levels are above 50%. Now you can imagine with this underperforming economy, we have growing inequality and poverty. And these are dangerous elements to have in a society where people have legitimate expectations of higher standards of living. Even the presidency itself acknowledges that South Africa still ranks amongst the most economically unequal societies in the world. We have a frightening phenomenon of a declining proportion of economically active people, which results in an increasing number of people dependent on social grants. 15 million of South Africa's 51 people draw some kind of social grant or other. We have grown that over the last 10 years from 8% to 31%. The deputy president of the country warned us that if we continue at this rate, we're going to hit a financial crisis. Amongst young people, we have an even bigger crisis because in the 15 to 34-year age group, we're looking at 71% unemployment. Young people who should be contributing to our economy are excluded. And that is a danger point. We have seen also the desperation of migrant laborers in the face of the problems that they face. There is a growing gap between workers and trade union leaders. The trade union leaders' interests are more aligned to those of government. And so the Marikana disaster is the outcome of this growing gap, where trade union leaders don't know what is going on the factory floor. So why are we South Africans failing to deliver on our potential? Why are we squandering our legacy? At its heart, I believe our problem is one of mindset. I have said that as we inaugurated democratic governance in 1994, we seriously underestimated what it would take to walk the journey from being subjects of undemocratic governments to being citizens of a constitutional democracy, reclaiming control over our lives. We did not stop and take the time at the beginning of our journey to work on shifting the mindsets from those of compliant subjects to those of dignified citizens. Too many of us sat back and said, well, Mr. Mandela is in charge, he'll take care of everything, and we're checking out. But it goes further than that. We have not yet overcome the fear of which Steve Biko spoke of more than 40 years ago in 1971, when he said of black South Africans under apartheid that they have been successfully cowed by brutality. He spoke of a fear that erodes the soul of black people in South Africa, a fear so basic in the considered action of black people as to make it impossible to behave like people, let alone a free people. Of course, our context has changed, but we South Africans have not yet eradicated the demons of our past. As black people, we have not yet psychologically liberated ourselves from the sense of inferiority and been able to take charge of our destiny. And white people, too, have become afraid to speak up in the democratic era. They are afraid that they will be called racist. And many, because they're still feeling guilty, are cowed. People in poor communities say that they are afraid of losing their social grounds if they stand up against the governing party. Leading professionals and business people are afraid to speak their minds, and some of them are honest enough to say, quite frankly, that they don't want to run the risk of their businesses losing government contracts. So, what are the solutions to our problems? What is to be done? Some of you know that I have never been a member of a political party ever in my life. I've never aspired to political office. Many of you will know that over the past year, I have come to the conclusion that civil society action alone is not going to change South Africa. Hence, the establishment of Ahang South Africa, which is Build South Africa. We will contest the national and provincial elections next year, and we will give voters a credible alternative to the ANC. And this we say because in 2009, fully 41% of registered or eligible voters did not vote. They couldn't bring themselves up to vote for what they called a corrupt ANC, nor could they vote for the Democratic Party because they are feeling that they can't really identify with its policies. The response that AHANG SA has received since our launch as a political party in February and as a party middle of the year has been huge. People believe that at least this creates a platform that they can identify with. We believe that restoring the promise of freedom is possible if we have clean government, a government that listens to people, a government that is accountable to them in a transparent manner that ensures competence and that is seen as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We at AHANG SA started unveiling our detailed policies, and some of our principled objectives includes an economy that can be restructured to become more competitive and thriving, more inclusive of all those who are currently on the margins of society. We believe that with competent leadership, we will grow jobs, we will boost infrastructure, and we will be able to have the skills that will be able to turn our country around. We also believe that we need to break down the monopolies and the cartels that are currently raising the cost of doing business in South Africa. In education, we want to build an education and training system that equips young South Africans for the challenges of the 21st century, which reignites their self-confidence and hopes to be part of shaping the country of our dreams. In the public service, we are going to have zero tolerance for corruption. We are proposing that only competent professional people should be in the public service. We will be doing a skills audit to make sure that only those who deserve to be there in terms of their attitude are in the service. We also are proposing a minimum 15-year jail term for anyone found stealing money from the public, and anyone in the private sector who is part of that problem. In the health sphere, we want to build a healthcare system that will make it possible that every South African receives quality healthcare irrespective of where they live, irrespective of their economic status or level of income. Crucial interventions in this area means that we need to have more professionals. South African health professionals are everywhere in the world. Very high-skilled people. Will encourage them to come home. With safety and security, we want to restore pride in policing, to help policemen live the values of a human rights policing culture. We want to make sure that we provide them with the resources, with the skills training, and with the rewards for good behavior. As the shareholders of our democracy, South Africans are saying that it's time for change. AHAM believes in the restoration of the founding principles of our democracy. We believe in placing people at the center of the democratic process. We believe on focusing on empowering people to govern. South African citizens are effectively being prevented from governing by the country's electoral system. That is why we have launched a 1 million signature petition for electoral reform. We believe that we need to bring the representative and the voter closer together in a mixed, proportional, and constituency-based system. We believe that this should be the first order of business after next year's election. Above all, We need to build social cohesion in South Africa. Many South Africans are imprisoned by our past, trapped in identities determined by colonialism and apartheid. For citizens, most of them still believe in the primary identities of ethnicity, religion, and economic class. We need to build a common sense of a South Africanism that we can all be proud of. We want again to rekindle the spirit that Mandela kindled in us 20 years ago, and to build a country of our dreams where human dignity, equality, and freedom will reign. Let me take you back to Oliver Tambo's words when he appealed to you in 1987. And I quote, "We would also like to convey to you something of the resolve of the despised million of our country, to be victims no longer, to emancipate themselves, and to free their oppressors from the burdens that all who practice injustice impose upon themselves. It is our hope that in the difficult days ahead, you will stand with us, lending your intellectual excellence to the accomplishment of these objectives, and that using the power you derive from the discovery of truth about racism in South Africa, you will help us to remake our part of the world into a corner of the globe of which all humanity can be proud." Some of those objectives that he outlined have been achieved, but many of those millions of whom Oliver Tambo spoke have been left behind in the last 20 years. They do not feel that they are citizens in charge of their own destinies. They need still to liberate themselves psychologically, socially, and economically. Despairing of being able to change their lot, many are disillusioned with democracy, and some are attracted by dangerous rhetoric from political demagogues. In June this year, President Obama made his first official visit to Africa. He came to speak to us in Cape Town, where he proclaimed what he called a new model of partnership between Africa and America, a partnership of equals, which focuses on the capacity of Africa to solve its problems and to grow. In the spirit of the President's outstretched hand, I want today to renew Oliver Tambo's appeal to you and to ask you to continue to stand with us, to combine your intellectual excellence with the intellectual excellence that we have developed to work with us through the School of Foreign Service, through the McCourt School of Public Policy, to challenge us and to build with us. In this way, we, South Africa and the United States, can serve not only the people of my country, not only the people of your country, not only the people of Africa, but we can serve all of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramphele, for that very insightful and interesting talk. We now have time for a bit of discussion. I would like to point out that we have 2 microphones on each of the aisles to invite people to come down and offer a question. But as we transition to that, I'd like to pose one myself, so I can take that prerogative. You mentioned the Ibrahim Index in the beginning of your remarks and some of the disturbing trends in South Africa. Another index, which I think a lot of folks may be familiar with, is the Afrobarometer, which is a public opinion survey of popular opinion across Africa. And it finds in South Africa, as elsewhere in Africa, that actually the public's demand for accountability is surprisingly low. That there's a gap between how much they want to hold their leaders accountable. And I wanted to ask you about this problem of accountability and what some of the tools are to mobilizing civil society, or indeed society at large, to begin to hold leaders accountable. Because it seems to me some of the challenges that you raise and some of the priorities that Ahang has are going to be very difficult to reach unless you can mobilize that civil society first, for people to take responsibility and to demand accountability of their leadership, of their government first. So I wonder if you might shed some light on that issue.
Africa suffers from the legacy of liberation movements, that people feel that they owe their freedom to these liberation movements. And also in the aftermath of a white colonial experience, they don't want to be seen to be criticizing a black government, because they seem to think that it will simply play up to the prejudices of the departing colonialists. But I think also at the heart of it, even the most educated Africans haven't really gone through this mindset change that I was talking about. That there is no real commitment to being a citizen who not only has rights, but responsibilities. We tend, as Africans, and we are all over the world, we just check out instead of challenging the status quo. And so in many countries, the intelligentsia is living abroad, and ordinary people are struggling just with survival, and many are afraid that if they raise their voices, like I said with South Africa, they'll take away the little that they have. So we have a big job in Africa of getting the civic education to be part and parcel of the school system, the university system, workplaces, places of worship, so people can really develop a greater sense of being agents of their own destiny.
And do we have to look to the state to provide that civic education?
No, I believe that religious leaders in my country, certainly, they played an enormous role during the struggle for freedom. They just checked out after 1994. We need to return to that. Civil society organizations need to be pushing this educating for democracy. But there is nothing stopping parents demanding that their children get civic education in the school system.
Okay. Please, go ahead.
Mamphela, this is Maureen Lewis. It's very nice to see you again
Lovely.
and to hear your stirring words. You have always been a wonderful leader, and it's wonderful to have you at Georgetown. I wanted to ask you a couple of things following on that. One of the problems South Africa has faced, and I do know the problem quite well, having done some work in South Africa not too long ago, has been the quality of education and sort of the poor quality of public education in particular, which makes the building of civic education very difficult, because there is a role for government in that and sort of shaping what it is. So I'm sort of curious about your views about that, since you are very much on the front line. And the second question I have, and it also has to do with South Africa rather than a general question, but the lack of political competition seems to be a bit of a problem, because you have a party that's been in power for 20 years who came in with all the right intentions. But I think we find that without competition, sometimes it's very hard to get the kinds of pressure that you need to move forward and to adapt to the kinds of things that the citizenry wants in a timely manner? And I'm sort of curious your views on both of those for South Africa.
With regard to civic education, I believe that despite the poor performance, or in fact because of the poor performance in education, we need to mobilize parents to demand that. And we need to get civil society organizations that do get involved, even in the public education space, to focus much more on this issue than we have done in the last 20 years. But the issue of competition is absolutely at the heart of it. As I indicated, people who didn't vote in 2009, and these include very educated young professionals, business people, and so on, just didn't have, in their view, a credible option. And that's part of the reason why I've chosen to do what I'm doing, despite my background of never being a member of a political party. It is because I passionately believe in the future of South Africa that I've decided to offer my leadership to break this mold. Because in a way, given my background as a freedom fighter, I can't be dismissed in the way that they can dismiss other players in the space. But obviously, the challenge for us is time, because the election is just around the corner. So we have to be very smart in using the social media platform to penetrate every young person's mind space. And we are making progress, but we need to make more progress. But we also need to get the help of the business community. I have been saying to the business community, the best way of improving the environment in which you do business is to make sure that we strengthen the democracy. And you need to make sure your workers on your factory floor, on your office floor, are actually educated to understand the power of the vote. Every vote is going to count in 2014. But we also need the international community to start preparing themselves to come and help monitor the elections of 2014. There will be attempts to steal. As I've indicated to you, we already are seeing very worrying trends within the IEC.
Let's go. I think it's on.
Okay. Dr. Ramphele, thank you for being here. I actually had a very similar question to what the lady asked before, but you spoke about social cohesion and how that is very important. And two landmark events in South Africa's post-apartheid history were the Rugby World Cup in 1995 and the FIFA World Cup in 2010. So what role do you think such events play in helping society become more cohesive, and in case South Africa?
Those events are important, but if you do nothing in between them, you lose the momentum, and that's exactly what's happened. One of the fundamental issues we are raising in terms of transforming the education system is to promote sports. Many children grow up going to schools, living in villages or townships where there is no sporting facility. And that really isn't a problem we should have in South Africa, because we have the resources to be able to build those. But I also believe that we need, again, to appeal to spiritual leaders to help us deal with the issues that break those links between people. But at the heart of it, there is a structural problem. Without social justice, you cannot have social cohesion. We need to address the gross inequalities in South Africa, the miserable poverty that people are immersed in a country with so much of resources. So for me, the issue of tackling the structural issues of an economy that should develop and that should create jobs, an education system, and a healthcare system that will be able to create the kind of human capital that will be able to build this cohesive society.
Back to this side.
Hello. My question, you mentioned before how you're trying to create a common South African identity and that people can be proud in their history. What concrete steps do you plan on taking to get around the past years of injustice that go back hundreds of years in South Africa?
Well, like any big problem, you take it one step at a time. One of the failures of post-apartheid South Africa is not to change apartheid's geography. You fly into any city, you can see where black people live and where the rest of us live. It is a crying shame. And therein lies the opportunity to kickstart the economy. Because imagine if you were to build human settlements that are more imaginative, where poor people live closest to the facilities in the town, where young people grow up in mixed residential spaces, where they don't grow up living with a granny and a mommy and that's it. But also, that issue of children who grow up together don't have these issues that we have. I mean, I look at my own sons. Khumelo is much more conscious of these issues. Malusi, who grew up in a completely different environment. I mean, for him, friends are just friends. So you don't even have to work at it. So we need to create the environment that will enable young people to do what young people do. They just love people because they're people.
Do you think you'll have the cooperation of, I mean, you talk about changing apartheid's geography.
Mm-hmm.
How much can you rely on those who are still beneficiaries of that geography to cooperate with this initiative, or these kinds of initiatives?
To successfully tackle that problem, you need to have a combination of incentives, leadership in the public sector, incentives for the private sector to be part of the solution. Because think about it. The private sector in South Africa is very hungry for building construction work. Now, if you did what they did in Ireland, actually, before you build a gated community, you build a low-income housing complex. Not very far from it, so that you create incentives and you restructure the way people think about where poor people live and where they don't. Many others are going to be more difficult, so you have to look also at transportation. Our public transport system in South Africa really is appalling. Again, the opportunity to boost the economy, to create jobs, is right there. And I believe also if we create an education system that creates self-confidence, people will be able to cross these boundaries much easier than if you can't read, you can't write, and you are supposed to have a high school diploma. You live a life of shame.
Let's go back, Professor Madava.
Thank you very much for what is, for some of us, a moving speech, and in many ways, a wake-up call for South Africa. It raised two issues in my mind. One is the fact that in order for political parties that are standing against the ANC to really bring about change, there will need to be some kind of coalition building among the opposition groups and parties. What are the possibilities, what are the chances of some of your colleagues and you coming together and forming that kind of a coalition? That's my first question. My second question is about leadership. I think for me, when I listen to your speech, it raises the fundamental question of what has happened in South Africa. Where is the leadership? And how are we going to rebuild that leadership?
The first question is absolutely at the heart of it. We have the confidence that if we can form electoral pacts underpinned by an agreement to have a coalition government, we can bring the ANC to below 50%. And I'll tell you why I'm so confident. If you look at the 2009 figures, 41% of those who didn't vote represent 30 million people. 5 more million people are becoming voters in 2014. Already you've got a hunting ground of 18 million people. Add to it 40% of ANC people who in surveys say they are disillusioned with the party because it's lost its way. That means that with smart working, with intelligent coalitions and pacts, we can in fact end up with a credible show at next year's election, because effectively the ANC today is governing with 38% of the eligible vote. So it is not impossible. The biggest challenge is the issue of egos. Now, I come into this not really interested in positions. I just want to do what you are talking about, this issue of leadership. It's all very well to sit and say, where are the leaders? So I had to step up to the plate and to invite other leaders to come to the fore. Many of my fellow freedom fighters are feeding at the trough, so they're not available. But there are many others who don't see themselves as leaders. And I'm knocking at their doors and saying, who are you waiting for? You are the leader you are waiting for. And there are many of them are people who were in senior government positions who got so fed up or got thrown out and are now just sitting. Many are business people, and we are getting some of them from the business sector coming over and saying, you know what, I want my children to grow up here. So I'm going to work for change in the government of this country. And we have people also from academia. Our policy positions have been developed by academics, not because they're doing this for research or for consultancy. They are doing it for the future of their children. So we are building a movement, a momentum of South Africans from across the spectrum to say it is in our hands. We have the power to change this country. And unlike many other African countries, we still have a constitutional dispensation that is more or less intact. If we don't do it now, Callisto, we will look like your country in 2019. And I'm very, very afraid.
I'm a little concerned, conscious of the time, so I think we have time. We can take 2 more, or if you want to take a few questions at once, maybe that.
Yeah, probably a few questions at once
so,
will do.
So why don't we, if you can keep, Sophia, your question to
I'll be short.
1 short question, and then let's take 3 from this side, and then we'll do 3 from that side, and we'll do them all at once. So please.
Dr. Ramphele, in your speech, you mentioned that there are 800,000 unfilled skilled jobs in the market, yet there are 600,000 unemployed graduates. What's the cause of that disparity, and what are the jobs that are needing to be filled, and what aren't the graduates doing to be able to fill them?
Hi, my question is about Black consciousness. Do you think that it like still exists in South Africa, and if it does, like, do you see it as fit?
See it as, what was the last part of your question?
Like as fit, is it okay with you?
Given that you've mentioned the relative strength of party bosses, is the parliamentary system of democracy still feasible, or would it be preferable to move toward a presidential system with more individual candidates?
Okay, let's start with the skills issue. Many graduates go to university to do, unlike here where you've got structured programs, people just do courses and end up with what qualifies them for a degree. It's left them with no real framework to be able to have expertise in one or other area. But also, even if they do get that, the quality of education, which starts in school, and by the time they go to university, some of our universities are not exactly the places you send your child. So we've got a systemic problem that cannot be dealt with in any way other than active intervention. So our proposal is to take all those 600,000 graduates and get them to submit to a process where they can find what is it that really grabs them, and then do on-the-job training with them. And we have the money. The government has created a layer called the SETAs, the Sectoral Education and Training Authority, that are absorbing 5 to 6 billion rand every year. Now imagine what we could do with that with on-the-job training. So I think that problem is solvable in that way by also creating incentives for the private sector to take people who are who finish school, who finish university on the job training. The issue of Black consciousness, that's why I talk about we need to build a South African consciousness. I was assisted by Black consciousness to overcome the inferiority complex of being Black in a very white, male-dominated environment. But today, we need a South African consciousness, which doesn't exist yet. That's why I talk about mindset change. People need to really ask themselves, who is the person inside here? And how is this person able to make a contribution which is unique? Each one of us have got a unique contribution to make on this globe. That's why we have been put here. But if you don't even know that, you spend the rest of your life as a victim of people who dominate you, or as someone who always feels inadequate. I think that this issue of consciousness raising is an important part and parcel of the civic education I was talking about, but it's also an important part of spiritual development, which should be happening. It doesn't matter what faith you belong to, but we unfortunately haven't always got the kind of inspirational faith leaders. The last question was on
presidentialism versus parliamentarian.
Well, I think that's going to be a very tall order in the South African context. I think we need to fix what's broken with the parliamentary system, which is this proportional representation was supposed to be a temporary measure, which has now become permanent because it works so well for party leaders. So we, the citizens, must insist on going back to what was agreed, which is a mixed system which allows us to make sure that everyone gets the right kind of representation.
Okay, very quickly, so short questions.
Hi, yes, hi, Dr. Ramphele. I'm a guilty intelligentsia person that you spoke about from South Africa. So my question is, those of us who are away from home, what can we do in very concrete terms to help forge Ahang, South Africa, and to really help build the movement before we come home? And secondly, if America is not ready for Hillary Clinton, we're not sure, we think she's going to run, what do you think in terms of our development as a country? Is South Africa ready for you to be the first female, Black female president?
That's two questions.
I know.
You can choose which one you want to answer.
My question is about migration, which has become an increasingly controversial and sensitive issue since South Africa opened its borders in 1994. My question is, what do you think the South African government should do about either internal migration regionally and international migration, both to South Africa and the migration of skilled laborers outside of South Africa, in order to capitalize on the development potential of international and regional migrants?
Okay.
My question is, are you worried at all about any violence that might result as part of a non-credible election?
Okay. Well, the first question about you being outside of the country. First and foremost, I would say get yourself informed about us. We are on the website, www.ahang.sa. But importantly, you still are a South African citizen. You have to mobilize your fellow South African citizens who are living abroad across the globe to register and vote. People have fought for you, and some have died so that you can vote. So that's very important. But in the run-up to that election, you can play an incredibly important role in helping us to mobilize both here and at home, because you still have a network at home. We need every one of you to make a contribution in terms of the skills you can bring. We've got a social media platform that is really quite respectable, but it can always improve. Come forward and tell us, what else can we do better? Look at our policies. Make comments about what you think what is missing. And of course, we need financial support. Every dollar translates to 10 rand. That's a lot. So think about it and get your people to commit to it. Your other question is really, I think it's a mood question. Whoever thought that Liberia was ready for a woman president, or Malawi? It's really not about the country waking up and say, we are now ready. It's about people stepping up to the plate, and people look for leadership, whatever its size and shape. And I don't have any real problems about that. Even this country will have a woman president one day. And I think Hillary perhaps is as good a person as any to step into that. The question of international migration is a real serious issue, because South Africa should be filling those 800,000 vacancies. But we are so retrogressive in our approach to such issues because we don't have a migration policy. We don't have a foreign policy. It's very hard. And so that's one of the areas where we as Ahang believe we would like to appeal to the South African diaspora, but we also want to appeal to others. Like Tambo said, we will need the international community to come forward and help us rebuild South Africa. We will need doctors, we will need engineers, we'll need town planners, we'll need people who know something about policing to help us clean up our systems. So I don't have any doubt that an international migration regime will have to be established that deals with that. There was one other question.
The last question was about your concerns about violence, and if the election is, as you suggested, could be, your concerns about the potential for violence.
That's why we've got to do it now, because at least now people still have respect for the rule of law. People still believe that it is possible to have a change in government. But if you have 5 more years of this government, that becomes extremely difficult, because by that time, most of the courts will be packed with judges who are not going to be on your side. And of course, everything would have been worse than I've just described. So I also believe having the international community take an interest in South Africa would be very important as a deterrent against such violence. I've been talking to the diplomatic community and will continue to do so. It is absolutely vital that we don't have the situation that we saw in Zimbabwe where the EU kind of cops out and says, well, whatever the AU says, we're going to go with that. I think that's unacceptable.
I want to invite all of you to join us for a reception in the Fisher Colloquium just now. But before we do that, I hope you will join me in thanking Dr. Ramphele for her wonderful talk and for visiting us. Thank you so much.